This podcast is supported by the Rebecca Vassie Trust, a UK-based charity which promotes the art of narrative photography through granting bursary awards to up-and-coming photographers and funding public education projects like this one. This podcast has full editorial independence, and the views expressed in this series are not necessarily those of the Trust. Welcome to Season 2 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Savannah Dodd, and I'm the founder of the Photography Ethics Center. Each week, I'll be talking with an accomplished photographer about the ethics of their practice. Today, in episode number 5, we'll be talking with Sarah Waiswa about listening first. Sarah Waiswa is a Uganda-born, Kenya-based documentary and portrait photographer with an interest in exploring identity on the African continent, particularly the new African identity. After getting both her sociology and psychology degrees and working in a corporate position for a number of years, she decided to pursue photography full-time. She aims to illustrate the plight of various social issues on the continent in a contemporary and non-traditional way. Sarah hopes to change the narrative on Africa by generating dialogue on developing issues as they happen. She's passionate about creating visual poetry and telling stories in the most organic and creative way possible. I wonder if maybe we could start by you just telling me a little bit about the kind of work that you do.
Okay. Well, I'm a documentary photographer. I primarily like to photograph social issues in a creative way, and mostly women's issues. I do, however, also work as a photojournalist from time to time. Yeah, that's what I do.
That's great. And what kinds of issues have you covered?
So I've worked on a number of issues, for example, like the police brutality during curfew times here in Kenya. I have done stories, for example, right now I'm working on a story about mental health. During COVID, I have done stories about people with albinism. I have photographed ballet that was happening in an informal settlement here in Nairobi. I also recently photographed an American pedophile who had created a children's home in Bomet County here in Kenya and then escaped back to the States. And he was just recently charged with those crimes. Wow. Yeah, so really it's just, yeah. So it's quite a range, I think. Like I said, the photojournalism really kind of introduces me to so many stories. But then, of course, there are positive stories as well, such as, women scientists. I just did a story about women coders. So there's, yeah. So, I guess there are positive things as well, which I like.
That's amazing. That's such like a wide gamut of types of stories that you're covering, even at the minute, from mental health during coronavirus to the American pedophile. Like there are so many ethical issues wrapped up in just those two stories alone, I would imagine.
Yes, absolutely.
What about with photographing a pedophile? How do you do that? Like what ethical considerations come into that? I think that's a really interesting example that we've not really covered yet.
Well, I didn't photograph him. He took off. So he went back to America. So the part of the story that I was photographing is kind of visiting that space, talking to some of the girls who he violated, parents of one of the children who died in that home, the school that he rented, the landlord of the school that he had rented out. So just kind of, everybody else, that he kind of left behind. So, we're talking about ethical considerations as, a lot of these girls are underage, And so it was hard, listening to them and trying to photograph them in a way that wasn't, of course, revealing their faces or, having to get permission from their parents to even do that and explaining all of that. So, yeah, it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy. It was quite a difficult assignment.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I guess doing so, sensitively as well is really challenging, especially depending on, I don't know, was it sort of a recent trauma or more of a historical trauma?
No, it's pretty recent, a couple of years.
Wow.
So these girls were, they're just teenage. Some of them went to the home when they were about 8. So now they're still underage. So it's recent.
Yeah.
It's recent.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
when you approach a story like that, for example, about
Mm-hmm.
sexual abuse or a story about
Mm-hmm.
mental health, or really any story that sort of can be quite sensitive or quite difficult for people to talk about, how do you first approach that? How do you first approach the people that you're working with?
So, if it's a commission project, for example, the pedophile story, I was working with a writer on that. So for me, essentially what happens is, the writer, I mean, we were together, of course, when we visited the town and the people in the story. But, primarily they ask the questions. And of course, at that point, it's just kind of listening and, just trying to understand, exactly what took place and all that. So I come in, a bit after that, of course. I mean, it's hard because for a story like that, you don't really get to spend that much time, with the people in the story. It's kind of like, if you're on an assignment, you have a limited time to complete the assignment and then you have to file the photograph. So, it's hard because you don't have that much time. But essentially after the writer kind of talks to the people in the story, then I step in and, I also kind of, have a conversation with them and ask if they're okay with me taking their photographs.
Absolutely. I think you touched on a couple like really complicated and challenging issues that sort of just come with the territory of the job, I guess. One of which is time, right? Just being really restricted in time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that I hear a lot from people who work in photojournalism is that these restrictions on time make it really hard to do the kind of groundwork that you might want to do otherwise if you were maybe doing it more long form. And the other thing that you touched on that I think is really interesting, and I don't think we talk about it enough on the podcast, is working with a writer. And I think there's a lot probably that goes into that, especially when it comes to, making sure that you're both on the same page about how you approach sensitive subjects, or I don't know, foster, that's a relationship in and of itself, right? That has a lot of ethical considerations in it. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your experience working with writers and how you navigate that.
Yeah, I think I've been lucky in a sense that most of the writers that I've worked with, we've kind of been, I guess, on the same page. I guess being from here, and understanding kind of the local language. A lot of the writers that I've worked with haven't been from here. A lot of them have been like they're Western writers, but they're based here. You know what I mean? So, I think it's worked out well. Like we've worked well together. But I think that what gives me a little bit of an advantage is because I speak kind of the local language. So it's also easier for me maybe to also connect with the people in the stories because, when it gets to when the writer's done kind of asking the questions and I come in, I can often change and speak in Swahili, which also puts people at ease, or I guess they recognize that I'm from here and, maybe that also puts them at ease. But I haven't been in a situation where I felt kind of uncomfortable with the line of questioning, which I know is very possible. I think that the writers that I've worked with, we've worked pretty well together, but I could definitely see that it could be a problem. I see that it absolutely could be a problem. Just to give you a different example, I also have done work with NGOs as well, right? And so that is a little bit different because, I once worked with an NGO and they had, flown in there, someone who works maybe in the comms department or, whatever department from the UK, and they came and then we went together into the field. So, I found that they were not as sensitive to kind of like cultural issues, right? So for me, being from here, like there's certain things that, or certain ways that I would approach or ask certain things. And, I found that individual wasn't obviously aware, one, but two, I kind of bothered by certain things or behaviors. But then I would say, I don't think that that's kind of how things work here, or, maybe we should try doing this, or just trying to explain certain things. And, because I think a lot of the issue is with NGOs who work in rural areas. When the people see them coming, they think that they've come with like money and gifts and all types of things, so they feel like they really have to perform in order to get those things. You know what I mean? So that's also quite difficult work to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, my own background is from sort of the international development sector. And I saw a lot of that, a lot of that sort of very, reciprocal is the wrong word, but just a very pronounced power imbalance. And, we're going to extract your stories or your information, and then we'll give you things for it. It just felt really uncomfortable and really wrong. And that's ultimately why I left, the industry, really. So no, that's really interesting, though. I wonder what that is, I guess, that you've experienced maybe fewer ethical issues when working with journalists than with people in the international development sector. I wonder if that's down to training.
I think that's definitely down to training. I mean, I think that even, all these news agencies have guidelines, you know what I mean? So, I mean, I'm sure people cross boundaries a lot of times. We've seen that, for example, in kind of recent discussions about Magnum and, whatever else. But I think that photojournalism has guidelines, and that, people, tend to try to kind of work within those guidelines. And also, if you're working for an agency that has, if you want to work with that agency, then you have to kind of follow those, not even agency, just like a, publication, whatever, then you have to follow, whatever guidelines that they provide, right? Whereas an NGO is kind of, I'm sure they say they have guidelines, but what happens in the field, like you said, you can't change the power imbalance that's so obviously there, because the beneficiaries are presented as beneficiaries, and already by being a beneficiary, there's already a power imbalance. You know what I mean? Because it's like, okay, we've given you all these things, now you have to take pictures, So I think NGO work is probably my least favorite work, because it's a very extractive kind of, because it's also like the briefs are very, make sure everybody's smiling, make sure it's positive, make sure people are happy, make sure, And yet when you go into these areas, it's not exactly sometimes it's not a smiley situation. Actually, a lot of times it's not really a smiley situation, but these people are like, oh, okay, we're supposed to smile. Okay, whatever you say,
Yeah.
And you have a brief, and like they expect certain things, and, if you don't follow the brief. So, yeah, I think, like I said, I think that kind of work is probably my least favorite work to do.
Are there any examples where you felt like the comms team from an international development organization actually did it really well, or not yet?
Well, I think they do it well when they allow you on the ground to kind of navigate the process, right? So what happens a lot of times is, like, if they say, this is what we want, even if they don't send someone, right? If they say, this is what we want, and I always will write back and say, well, this is what I recommend. You know what I mean? This is what's on the ground. So this is what I recommend. And, I think the best organizations to work with are those that listen, right? And say, okay, well, let's see how we can kind of navigate that. Or, as opposed to maybe those that are like, no, this is the brief, this is what we want, and that's it. So, yeah, I think the best organizations are the ones who work with local photographers and kind of are flexible in terms of like, okay, this is what we want. We'll work with you to see how best you can tell those stories. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I guess I wonder, I think that's really valuable advice. At the same time, I think it's probably quite difficult for photographers to feel like they have the ability to maybe go back to the commissioning organization and say, there's a power imbalance involved in that as well, right?
I'm saying that now because I've learned, right? I think I'm in a position now where I've worked in the industry and I've gotten to the point where I know that this is the type of work that I will or won't do. That these are the types of things that I'm not willing to do. But, I'm talking from a point of now. I'm talking from a point of the privilege that I've had to learn, the privilege that I had to be in the position that I am in today. When I was starting out, oh no, of course, I was just happy to have work, right? Of course, I would never have said, I never probably said anything, I was just like, okay, I must. But now I've established a name. I'm hoping that people who seek me out to do whatever work that they want to do, that they, that one, they're familiar with my work, but two, that if I am able to voice that I'm uncomfortable performing, any type of work, that I can walk away from an assignment and not feel like, of course, as a freelancer, you want assignments and you need to make a living. But I feel that I'm in a position now where if an assignment is not right for me, then I just won't take it. But, there are those young photographers or people who don't have the privilege to turn down assignments that, of course, it's not as easy as voicing concerns and pointing things out, So, yeah. I think that there's an absolute imbalance in that way, too, is that not everybody is able to speak up.
Absolutely. And what would you recommend then to maybe photographers who are not as established in navigating those conversations? Or, how do they deal with that? What would you recommend?
I think community is really important. So I think it's nice to reach out maybe to another photographer, someone who you think is, has probably done the work before or might have some good advice for you, So, hey, this is the assignment been commissioned to work on, and maybe I'm uncomfortable about this or that. And maybe that photographer can say, hey, why don't you use this type of language to kind of raise this point? Or just, I think that's why it's nice to have a mentor, or just like I said, it's even community in terms of like just being able to kind of bounce back, like, what do you think about this? And does it sound right to you? Do you have any advice on what I can say? And, that type of thing. I think that's really helpful.
Absolutely. No, I think that's really valuable for people to hear. I think there probably isn't enough opportunities for that just yet.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about maybe things that you wish that you'd known when you first started out as a photographer?
Sure. I think when I started photography, one of the things that now like irks me is, this idea of being the voice of the voiceless. I think when I was starting out, like that sounded so, I don't know, it sounded like so cool, right? But that I quickly after, after kind of working and just learning about photography, just realized that, that was absolutely just not true. I mean, I don't think anybody can be the voice for anyone else, And so I think I wish that was clear for me early on.
How did you, what made that realization switch for you that that's not what you're doing? You're not being a voice for anybody. And maybe how do you conceive of your practice instead now? How do you view, your role as a storyteller and a photographer now, as opposed to how you used to? And what made that change?
I think anytime that you are telling other people's stories, it has to be a collaboration, Yes, you have the tool, you have the camera, but at the end of the day, you have to work with someone in order to be able to tell a story. And not even per se. And I think the realization came to me is that, you're not even at the end of it all telling their story. I think you're just telling a version of their story. Because again, you're the one with the camera. You see what you want to see based on a number of things. And so at the end of the day, it's just a version of their story, but not really, not really their story. And I think I came to this just after working on several stories and just, each time realizing that, when you go in, you have to listen, you have to try to understand. And I mean, if you're there for just a short time, really, what could you really possibly understand? So I think it's just something that has come over time, and then, of course, becoming familiar with other people's work and reading and learning and studying and, learning about photography and the history of photography and all those things, just kind of working together to kind of come to this point.
I think there's so much in what you just said, but the thing that really struck me was when you said that, you're telling a version of their story and that, there are many versions and many ways that you could maybe tell a person's story. And I think that's a really useful thing to remember. And I guess I wonder, keeping that in mind and keeping in mind what you said earlier about time, and the limitations of time. I wonder, is there anything that you do before you start a project, before you go in and start photographing? Like, what kinds of things do you do to familiarize yourself with the story, and how can others learn from that?
I mean, I think the story doesn't start with you, busting out your camera. I think doing some research, reading up on, trying to understand the issue yourself about, what it is. And I'm talking about this like, from a perspective of, if you're working on a personal project, because a lot of times when you're working on an assignment, it could be like, hey, are you available tomorrow? Can you go tomorrow? So, you just don't even have time to even, do any research about it. But I think in the event that you're working on a personal project, then you have time to kind of say, okay, this is a project I want to work on. Let me try to understand, the issues here, and why is it important for me to tell this story, and how am I going to tell this story? So I think asking yourself all these questions is important before you start a story, and even just questioning your own perspective at that point, like, why do I think it's important, and how am I even connected to this story? And, those type of things I think is important before you even get out there and into the field. If I can, I absolutely try to. And of course, like I said, time is a factor always. That I try to at least maybe meet with people before I even photograph them, if it's possible, just so that you can build at least some sort of relationship before you bring out this tool. So yeah. I mean, I think there's a number of things to do, but I think, doing a little bit of research and familiarizing yourself on whatever issues are in that story and trying to see if you can also build a relationship is ideal. And I say ideal because it's not always the case.
Absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. And what are things that when it is maybe an assignment and you do get the call that, tomorrow you've got to go photograph something and you don't have the time maybe to put in the research that you would otherwise like to do, what kinds of things could maybe the commissioner or the photographer do to compensate, I guess, for the lack of time? Is there anything that can sort of make up for that?
Sometimes, in some instances, the editor might say, hey, this is what's going on. Maybe here's a link to a story that we've already written, and maybe this is a follow-up. So then you can kind of read and see like, oh, okay. Or a lot of times it's just like a paragraph, like this is what it's about now, go tomorrow,
Yeah.
But sometimes they will give you links like, oh, this is an assignment to photograph so-and-so, here's a little bit of background about them. Sometimes it does happen like that, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's like, here's a general kind of situation. So figure it out. Yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And you spoke about, which I think is definitely a question that's sort of growing in our collective consciousness right now about, why is it important that I tell this story? And I think that's a question that people are really starting to ask themselves in a way that they didn't maybe previously engage in that kind of reflexivity. Mm-hmm. And I guess I was just wondering if you could maybe elaborate on that a little bit or discuss that from sort of your perspective or your experience.
I think early on, there was a conversation about how foreign journalists, would kind of fly in and cover a story and leave. And, of course, that's kind of frowned upon, especially by local kind of photographers and local photojournalists. But I think it's also important to consider that even as an African telling stories about Africa, I think it's still important to consider that, that we could possibly be doing the same thing in various different communities. If I go and photograph a story in an informal settlement, I'm an outsider too, essentially, And so thinking about that as well, I think thinking about that shift, as well, was important for me in my career, because at the end of the day, anytime you go into a situation like that, you're already going in there. One, you don't belong to that community. Two, you're going in there with a camera. Three, you're going in there with privilege, And so I think that's important to consider, that just because you're not a white foreign journalist, you still have a responsibility even in that situation, because you yourself are still an outsider and have to kind of take the same considerations in order to not kind of jet in and jet out to tell whatever stories that you're telling, even in communities, around you.
It reminds me a little bit of an interview I did recently with The Other, which is a UK-based group of female photographers from working class communities. And, I feel like class is something that we don't talk about enough. And I think that that's a really important consideration, that they're not only are there sort of ethnic, racial, and geographic differences sometimes between photographers and the people that they're photographing, but also class differences, also regardless, a difference, I guess, of access to media, and then that fundamental imbalance of the person who's telling the story, right? Versus the person who the story is
absolutely
about.
And, a lot of times, particularly with photojournalism, is once you've left, that's it. Like, it's not like you go back there and say, hey, this is where the photos were published, or, you've reported on that issue. You don't go back.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sort of this, it still can be quite an extractive process, I guess.
Absolutely.
Even if you're not technically a parachute photographer. I think that's a really
exactly.
important.
And that's the point that I guess I was trying to make is, you might not be the, white parachute photographer, but I think it's important still to consider the extractiveness sometimes of the process and just being mindful and, how do you navigate that?
Something that we talk about sometimes in particular with photojournalists, but also with documentary photographers, is this idea of moral injury and how the things that we see, either when we're photographing or when we're going back and editing images, it can be quite traumatic. Is there anything that you've found, or has this been an experience for you? And if so, how have you dealt with that? And what sort of things have you been able to put in place?
Can you expound? Give me an example. Can you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah. I'm thinking about that idea of leaving, the fact that you can leave. But just because you're leaving doesn't mean that you aren't impacted, I guess, yourself in your own way. And I think that sometimes that impact can be hard to manage emotionally.
If we look at the story that I told you about, like the pedophile, right?
Yeah.
Like talking to those girls and, just listening to the stories of how he would, violate them and whatnot. And then kind of having to leave. I'd say especially for me, it's like I still think about those girls, every single one of them. And that has never really left, And of course, the story was published and, he was sentenced in the States and he'll be doing time. But I just thought about the brokenness that he has left behind, and it stays with me. I think about those girls all the time. I think about that situation all the time. I think it's just something that doesn't leave you,
Yeah. One question that I want to ask everybody who comes on the podcast is, what does photography ethics mean to you?
I think the first thing I would say is that recognizing that just by virtue of you having a camera, that you have a certain power, depending obviously on the type of photography that you're doing, but that you have a certain power over, the people that you're photographing. And so being conscious of that, I think is really important. And I think if you're conscious of that, how you navigate kind of the storytelling and how you use that power, I think is really important, and not abusing that power. I think that's what photography ethics is really trying not to abuse the power that the camera gives you.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to share new insights about photography ethics with others. So if you heard something you liked, please share this podcast with someone who would appreciate it. The links to all things mentioned in this episode are available in the show notes at www.photoethics.org. Join me next week when we hear from Waleed Shah on breaking stereotypes. If you're enjoying this podcast, why don't you check out our online courses? We've developed a series of 3 online courses designed specifically for photojournalists and documentary photographers. We discuss questions like, how do we achieve accuracy in our photographs? What's the relationship between power and consent? And when, if ever, should we intervene? These online courses come with perks, like access to an online community group for discussion and Q&A opportunities with me, the course leader. Enroll today at www.photoethics.thinkific.com or go to www.photoethics.org and click Online Courses. This podcast was edited by Ellie Gascoigne.